I'm here to talk to you about the past, about personal past, and about the broader past that we regard as history, about how we view the past, how we come to terms with it, how we accept it. Now, one of the things about growing older is that the past looms ever larger. There is more and more of it. And this past is rich in possibilities. It is never still. It is constantly buffeted. It is subject to the eddies and the lacunas of memory. The past is vibrant. In fact, compared to the past, the future can look rather wan. After all, we all know where the future ultimately leads. For each of us, in the end, there awaits Henry James's distinguished thing. Along it comes with a bang or a whimper. Now, a friend said to me the other day, who would ever want to turn 90? The answer is somebody who's 89. And my grandmother always used to say, old age is not for sissies, but nor, of course, is the alternative option. So on we go, accumulating past, accumulating history, like kids guzzling candies. But of course, the past is never quite past. As Faulkner observed, the past is never dead. In fact, it's not even past. Or, as a Yugoslav communist once observed, there is nothing more dangerous for a communist than predicting the past. So we have to try and deal with it, come to terms with it. I'm a journalist. I'm a newspaper man. I always wanted to tell stories. And to tell stories, you have to evoke the present. You have to try and convey it in as vivid and fair and clear terms as possible. That was my mission. But of course, to understand the past, you have to turn time's arrow backward. You have to understand how this situation arose. We are all the sum of our lived moments. And as I went out into the world to write stories, and it's a wonderful thing, by the way, if you can ever find somebody to pay you to go out and discover the world, well, that's what I did, and did for a long time. And often I found myself in situations of conflict. I found myself in war zones. I find myself dealing with lives that had been upended, lives that had been overturned, lives that were in chaos. I remember the children of Beirut in 1983 who could not sleep without the familiar and so reassuring sound of gunfire. I remember a Polish priest whom I met shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, who was coming to terms with the fact that he had discovered that he was in fact Jewish, that his Catholic parents at the last minute to save his life had handed, his Jewish parents, at the last minute, had handed him to a Catholic family in order to save his life. The ferocity of the war in Bosnia, stirred up by nationalists injecting the virus of hatred into mixed families. Argentine Twins, the children of a woman murdered by the junta, who had been abducted by the junta commander, childless junta commander, who had ordered their deaths. Or the German woman I knew in Berlin, who had the most beautiful blue eyes, but who couldn't stand to look into her blue eyes because they reminded her of her father, a concentration camp commander. So I was looking into trauma, I was looking into the impact of the past on lives. And then one day in Italy, it occurred to me that running from dateline to dateline, constantly rushing around the world, I had neglected to turn my mind to the most dangerous dateline of all, me. The most dangerous dateline for me, was being still, was being in one place and looking inward. Where did I come from? Who was I? What had gone into my past? Was I not also, perhaps, from a displaced and traumatized family? And so I decided, fairly late in my career, to go to that dateline called me and to look into my story, so placid and and comfortable on the surface. I was a child of privilege in Britain. But was I really? I was the children of immigrants, South African immigrants. We were an immigrant family, although that word was never pronounced. I was the child of a Jewish family that had moved repeatedly over all of the past generations, first from Lithuania to South Africa around the end of the 19th century, my great-grandparents and grandparents. Then from South Africa, my parents, to Britain, part of the family from South Africa to Israel as Zionists, and I myself from Britain to the United States, of which I'm now a citizen. And I began to ask myself about all this displacement because, of course, especially if you're an American, you regard displacement, moving on, as possibility, as hope, as opportunity. That is its bright star. But the black sun of displacement is loss. It's leaving something behind. It's trying to forget. It's beginning again, which can be arduous. It's arduous to start again without the familiarity of your surroundings. And as I looked into my family history, I discovered that my mother had lived in a cocoon of new South African wealth. Her grandfather had arrived as a prospector. He'd made good. He started out as what was called a smouse, a traveling salesman. Then he had a small store. And ultimately, he was the co-founder of the OK Bazaars, which was, if you like, the Macy's of South Africa. The John Lewis. It turned into a big department store. So my mother grew up in this cocoon of new South African privilege. And in the 1950s, she married a young physician, my dad, who now actually lives here in St. Andrews. That's the end of the Odyssey, age 93. And they moved to 1950s Britain, to post-war Britain, with its cold, with its rationing, living in a small apartment, my mother putting coins in a meter for hot water. And my mother arrived pregnant with my younger sister, Jenny, and she cracked up. She broke down. She collapsed. She had what was then called postpuerperal psychosis, now known as postpartum depression. And when I was age 2, she disappeared into various institutions, only to re-emerge 2 years later. And that past, that history, my own, was suppressed. It was hidden. I knew nothing about it growing up. Of course, I'd felt and absorbed the absence of my mother as a child. It made a huge imprint on my psyche, but in my conscious mind, I had no memory of it. And I decided that I had to apply my journalistic skills to myself, to my family. I had to find out what had happened to my mother, who died 16 years ago in London. And so I began to look into my family story, finally. And in an attic in a house in Wales owned by my parents. My father loved it. He loves nature in the wild. He doesn't mind the cold. He lives here, after all. Gusty, blustery, wet, rainy Wales. Everything my mother hated. She always yearned for the sun of South Africa. She pined for the sun of South Africa. And I was up there, and I went up into the attic. This is a trunk in the attic story. And I found some papers, and in them were my mother's 2 suicide notes of 1978 and 1982, and my father's, in both cases, she was almost successful, but not quite. She ultimately died of cancer. But cancer for her was a legitimate way out, as she put it. She held it in complete contempt compared to mental illness. And there were my father's very precise annotations about the annus horribilis of 1978, about 1982, and the time in between. And there was a family tree, and he'd placed black dots on the family tree beside the names of everybody who had suffered from mental illness. And seeing this, I decided I had to try to find out what had happened. So I began my research. It was long research. It took me back to Lithuania for the first time, to Zagreb, where on October the 2nd, 1941, the 2,473 Jews of Zagreb were rounded up and shot and thrown into a mass grave in the forest. So now I knew what would have happened to my family if they had not left Lithuania. It was very simple, it was very brutal, it was very straightforward. And by the way, that was memorialized for a long time by the Soviets who occupied Lithuania as the murder of anti-fascists. That was what the plaque said. So you see how the past gets falsified, how the past gets manipulated in the name of ideology. For the Soviets, these had to be anti-fascists. They couldn't be merely Jews. It took me to South Africa, where, by the way, I learned the power of hope. Never forget hope. Throughout my childhood, I was told apartheid would end in cataclysm. The swimming pools would be red with blood. Well, it didn't turn out that way. And it took me to Israel, where I discovered that my cousin had also been manic-depressive, had committed suicide at the age of 28. My mother, in her later years, was manic-depressive. And so I journeyed on, and eventually, through Britain's Freedom of Information Act, I was able to discover my mother's medical records from 1958. So finally, I found out. I found out what had happened in my family. I saw the ledger of her admission to the Holloway Institution outside London. June Bernice Cohen, age 29. Her age hit me so hard, so young. Religion, C of E, 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 Jew, C of E, C of E, C of E, C of E. And the notes from the psychiatrist attending her, describing the intense discussions between my father and mother about her being subjected to electroconvulsive or electroshock therapy, which in the 1950s was administered not in the way it is today, but as you saw maybe in the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you shuddered, bones could be dislocated, limbs could be dislocated. So I know now, at last, at this relatively late stage in my life, that on July 30, 1958, 3 days before my third birthday, my mother was wheeled into a room, electrodes were clamped to her skull, and electricity passed through her, and I know that it happened again one day before my third birthday, and I understand better why my mother, who was full of love and always wanted to give love, always struck me later in life like a tree hollowed out by lightning. Now, you may ask me, why would you want to know that? Why would you want to know the past? Well, I think it's important. Everything in my life has taught me that if you suppress memory, it comes out again. And this hit me most powerfully when I was covering the war in Bosnia. I discovered then that the past is present. It is there. I remember gazing with a soldier out into the haze in 1994 as he gazed toward his hometown and from which he'd been driven by the Serbs. And he said to me, "I can see my home. I can see my home. I'm fighting to go home." He could no more see his home in that haze than I could, but he could see it in his mind's eye. It was potent. And for the Serbs, the Muslims of Bosnia had been transformed by cynical leaders into Turks, into the Ottoman Turks of old, who'd reached the gates of Vienna, who'd gone through Serbia. These largely secular Muslims of Bosnia, who had been indistinguishable Yugoslavs just 6 months before, were suddenly Muslim fanatics who wanted to place the crescent moon atop the spires of the churches of Christian Europe. Memory had been manipulated so powerfully that it had literally transformed people who had lived together harmoniously into the most powerful, most desperate of rivals. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the power of memory, of suppressed memory. The Bosnian Serbs and Croats refought in the 1990s, before my eyes, the Yugoslav civil war of the 1940s that had been taboo, that had been suppressed by Tito, that could not be talked about. The olive groves of 1948 for the Palestinians have become not something that is really attainable to go back to those olive groves outside Haifa, but a passe-partout, an open sesame, if you like, only to further violence. And similarly, history can be blinding. Victim can become oppressor behind an Israeli shield of never again. So the real issue, I think, is to get history, get the past into balance. It can be dangerous. It is very dangerous to suppress memory, not to remember, whether within a family or on a broader scale. But it can be equally dangerous to be overwhelmed by memory, to remember too much. That is what we have to guard against. I am very fond of the lines of the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. And there's a poem of his in which a guide is addressing tourists in Jerusalem. And he says, more or less, look over there. You see that arch from the Roman period? It's not important. It's not important. But there, down and just to the left, sits a man who's just bought fruit and vegetables for his family. That Roman arch is not going to be put food on tables and give the children of the Holy Land a future. But that man who is just going about his daily task just might. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we have to balance our view of the past, not try to bury it, because then it will return to haunt us, very often in bloodshed. Not to be blinded by it, obsessed by it, so that we refight the wars of the past and simply allow ourselves to go into a widening gyre of sorrow. One of my sons lives in Vietnam. I'm always struck there by how the graves lie among the rice paddies, death and life together. It is not suppressed. It is not hidden. There are no martyrs calling us to further sacrifice. Those celestial virgins have a lot to answer for. And there are parts of the world that are able to absorb the past. Americans are welcome in Vietnam now, precisely 40 years after the war. There are parts of the world that are able to find a balanced view of the past, and others, like the Balkans or the Middle East, that are not. So please, try always to find balance. Don't neglect the past. Don't be overwhelmed by it. And in that way, we can avoid victimhood. We can move forward. We can be decent citizens. We can put food on the table. We can go about our daily tasks. And we can build a better world. Thank you very much.